Africa, you are welcome to AU Talks on AU TV. AU TV, the voice of higher education. My topic for today's discussion is research and innovation for change and development in Africa. We'll go for a short break, and when we'll come back, I will introduce to you my guest for today's discussion. My name is Irene Dufie Addai, and I'll be your host. Stay tuned.
Anyone can get an education, but not everyone gets quality education. It's never too late to acquire it. The University of Lusaka, a modern private university located off Ali Kinkata Road in Lusaka, Zambia, offers undergraduate, master's and PhD degree programs in the School of Business and Management, Law, Economics, Banking and Financial Services, Public Administration, Governance and International Relations, Education, Engineering and the Built Environment, and Health Sciences. Our curriculum is practical and designed to meet the changing needs of employers, business and society. Because at Unilus, we make students think outside the book. Our driving force is a passion for quality education. We build graduates fit for purpose. Enroll now for January or June intakes. For more information, log on to www.unilus.ac.zm.
Welcome back. My guest for today's discussion is Dr. Maurice Bolo. He is the director of the Scinnovent Center, Kenya. Welcome, Doc. Thank you for having us today in your office. We have a very interesting topic that we want to talk about, and that is research innovation for change and development in Africa. So briefly, we want to talk about the Scinnovent Center and why it's important. It was established. So can you give us a brief background of it?
Thank you very much, Irene. The Scinnovent Center was established in the year 2011, right, and has been in operation since then, but much more actively in the latter half of 2012 until today. Right. The reason for establishing the center was actually need-based. If you look at the name, Scinnovent itself is a contraction of three words: science, innovation, and enterprise. And the idea behind that name is that you have research on one component, scientific research, and on the other end you have enterprise, or what you would call the private sector. In between and connecting the two are issues of innovation. Right. So the idea is, how do we connect the research that we conduct in our research institutions and in our universities to development? And when we say to development, is about how do we get the private sector particularly to then take the findings of research, turn them into innovation products, and then we get that into our socioeconomic development framework. Right. So that essentially is the philosophy behind the Scinnovent Center. And the reason we actually established the center is the realization that a lot of times we had research and policy research in science and technology, but a lot of the focus has always been on the public sector, on the government and the decision makers. In the end, we have left out the private sector and what we would call the beneficiaries of our research in that discussion. And so our idea was to try and say, how do we bring the private sector into this discussion? How do we bring the private sector into this conversation? How do we support them? Because at the end of the day, when science, technology, and innovation policies do not make sense to the private sector, our view is that it doesn't make sense to development. Right.
So when we even talking about the private sector and then the universities as in students who study, normally we say the students are half-baked because we don't know, we are not being well taught on what industry needs. And so I think it's a requisite factor that we bring the industry into what our policies and then what we do. But before we go on, we wanted to know, what is the focus area of the Scinnovent Center?
Thank you. Now, broadly we talk about science, technology, and innovation, and that can be a very broad thing. Right? At the center, if you think of it sectorally, we actually focus a lot more on agriculture and health. A lot more at the moment. So most of our studies have had to do with innovation in the agricultural sector. And that is befitting because, again, a lot of our economies are agri-based. Yes. All right? And then we think issues of health and healthcare delivery are very important. Now, those two things connect very well to industrialization and Africa's quest to become knowledge-based economies. So we do try and make sense of issues around agriculture, health, and industrialization put together. So our focus at the moment is a lot more on, if you think sectorally, then agriculture and healthcare delivery.
Very well.
Yes.
So talking about agriculture and health, which is we know is the basics for every economy, we want to know, since it's a science and innovation center, can you briefly give us the importance of science and innovation for Africa? Because we know science is leading the way for Africa. Can you give us some of the few importance that Africa can benefit from that?
Yes, I think much more generally we must agree that science, technology and innovation actually underpins development. We haven't known any other country, whether in the developing world or the newly industrialized countries or the developed countries, that has gotten to where they are without science, technology and innovation. And so the basics of it is that science, technology and innovation actually is going to be the bedrock upon which African economic takeoff must be founded.
Right.
Now, this is already happening in a number of areas. If you look at a number of our African countries, today we have what we call forward-looking blueprint development or development blueprints. And so countries have their long-term visions. You know, Kenya has Vision 2030,
yes.
Rwanda has 2025, Tanzania, Uganda 2020, and that kind of thing. But if you look at all these development blueprints, the foundation is science, technology, and innovation.
Right.
We at least acknowledge that in our policy documents. Now, certainly there are challenges to turning that into actual programs and projects. And that's a different discussion. But all the same, at least we acknowledge that this is very important for us.
Yeah.
Now, whether you talk industrialization, whether you talk agriculture, or you talk health, or you talk ICT or renewable energy, all this is based on science, technology, and innovation. And therefore, I think it is a very important and critical area that Africa must begin to focus on if we are going to get the economic takeoff that we want.
Right. So in Africa, we know there are a lot of barriers to science and technology.
Yes.
And as an expert in the field, can you give us why these barriers are still there?
I mean, there are definitely barriers to, first of all, the generation of the scientific research and the knowledge that we require, and then the uptake and utilization. So if you look at the generation component of it, one, we are not putting inadequate resources in our research systems. We have had policy pronouncements about Africa needing to put at least 1% of our GDP into research. And this is a song we've sung since the Lagos platform in 1980 until this moment. How many countries in Africa have reached that? Maybe one or two, and it is fluctuating downwards anyway. Right? So a lot of lip service, in my view, that we give to science, technology and innovation, especially in terms of research and putting our resources there. Secondly, in the generation part, we are having issues with our capacities and the technical capacity. So we have the number of our researchers, for example, that are supposed to generate this information is quite too low, way too low. We don't even have the critical mass of researchers that we require to generate the science and technology. So that's another barrier. If you come to then the implementation or application side of things, then we have a problem. If you look at most of our African countries, the policies are very good, very well written, right? Very well thought out, but we hardly implement any of those. So if you were to check, you would realize the policies are very good. These are things that if we did, we would get the transformation that we require at the end of it, but we hardly implement them. Now that gives you then back the question, what is this thing we call a good policy? Okay. If we cannot implement them, then they're not good for the continent.
Right.
And the reason they're not good for the continent sometimes is because we simply borrow from elsewhere and think we can transplant that into Africa and it will work. Normally it doesn't.
Yeah.
If you move from that section and say, what about uptake and utilization of some of the research that we get, then again we have a problem. Africa, we have this challenge of having to doubt ourselves. So much so that the research that we generate from here, we hardly trust it, if you want. We always want a second opinion from elsewhere to try and inform and to make us believe in our own systems. Yet, as I always say, our own sons of Africa are giving that second opinion elsewhere. But we don't value our own. All right? So that, to me, is a challenge. So there are several barriers if you look across the board. There are certain things we could point out. There are certain things that we could deal with. I think a good number of them are about just changing our mindsets as Africans. Beginning to believe that research done at the University of Ghana, Legon is as valid as research done in Cambridge.
Yeah.
And that we can actually use our own contextualized research and research findings for the betterment of Africans' economies.
Right. That's very well, since we are supposed to believe in ourselves and then what we can do. But we want to focus more now on research. We know Africa produces not more than 2% of research in the world. And looking at this is quite embarrassing if we are putting it in words and we are being truthful. What are some of the causes of this situation we are having in Africa? Low research.
Okay, first, we must accept that research is very expensive. All right? And we are not going to get any good results if we do not invest in our own research. And I think, without battling an eyelid, I would say our governments are doing poorly in terms of investing in our research and in our research systems. And therefore, if you have a low input, you'd obviously expect a low output. So it doesn't surprise me that we are not doing very well in terms of research in Africa, that what we generate is quite low because what we invest is quite low. If you look at most of our African institutions and universities, okay, what our governments give to research institutions and universities is basically operational money. There is no research money at all. And therefore, a lot of research is dependent on external funding.
Right.
All right? Up to, in certain countries, up to probably 90% of the total funding for research is externally driven. Now, when you have people from outside coming to invest in research in your own countries, they have their own agenda.
Right.
Right? They have something they want to achieve. So all we are doing is tagging along what they want.
They want, not
we are not necessarily
necessarily
addressing African priorities.
Our problems, yeah.
Exactly. And we are not going to address those until we are able to put our own money on the table. So research and investments in research is really important. Secondly, I think we have reached a point where we have to prioritize the kind of things we need to do. If you go to our universities today, especially in my country, Kenya here, is that you will find universities offering all manner of courses, and we don't have the specialized universities, if you want. We are losing that. But I think we must refocus back and have universities be able to play to their comparative or competitive advantages.
Yeah.
So if one university is good in medicine, for example, let's say we can pinpoint this university for medicine. So if you went to Kenya and you want to do medicine, you can only go to
one of them.
That is where your focus would be. But we are having everybody doing everything. We don't have then the focus on the innovation work. Secondly, at the universities level and in our research, which is where we generate a lot of the knowledge, there is a lot of emphasis on teaching rather than research. So if I was a lecturer at the university, then I would spend my time from 8 to 5 teaching. And then maybe from 5 to a few hours, then I would give that to research. So now this is about workload policy at the universities. All right? And the professors don't just have the time to do research. And I think that is something that needs to be dealt with from internal university research policies.
Yeah.
The second thing is about career tracks. We have universities, a lot of times for you to move up the ladder is about sometimes how many years have you been teaching, how many papers have you published out of this work and all that kind of thing. And that is pretty good. I think what we need to do is create different career paths for different people. There are people who want to work with the universities, but they just want to do research. I don't want to bother about the 100 students and marking papers. I just am good at generating money for research and carrying out the research. So there should be a research-rich career path and a teaching-rich career path at the same university. Then you take care of everybody. Other than saying everybody to go and teach from 8 to 5, then find your own time to do research.
Right.
So I think the workload policy, the career progression policies of the universities, and other incentive structures need to be reorganized for us to achieve the impact of research that we want.
Yeah.
The final thing is, how do we bring the private sector into funding and investing in research? And I think that's a big one, right? It starts with, first of all, understanding the kind of private sector that we have. A lot of our so-called private sector are small and medium
scale enterprises.
Yeah. Now, a lot of times these are people who operate not necessarily with any formal R&D budgets, but they do R&D. Okay, so we need to come back to their level and say, how do you define research and development within your context, and what does it mean? If you take money and put in some apparatus, if you take money and put in some quality testing system, is that part of a research framework? And how do we quantify that so that we are able to talk about this company, which is a local pharmaceutical manufacturing company, being able to invest in research? And so we get the definition of research that fits within our context. Then we will find that actually there's a lot more contribution that we're not accounting for.
All right. So on this note, we'll go for a short break, and when we'll come back, we'll continue with our discussion. This is AAU Talks on AAU TV. You can watch us live on the Association of African Universities on Facebook and YouTube. Stay tuned.
Why University of Ilorin?
I chose the University of Ilorin for a number of reasons. One of them is the fact that the university has a very conducive environment. It provides students with a proper academic environment.
I chose the University of Ilorin because of the good culture they try to imbibe in students, in the aspect of improving their morals, and also in the aspect of improving their dressing in terms of decency.
It feels good knowing that your 4 years is 4 years and your 5 years is 5 years. Unlike a number of schools in Nigeria where your 4 years course might last 5 years, 6 years, or even 7 years in some extreme cases. But University of Ilorin, better by far, your 4 years course is 4 years course. And it feels good knowing that after 4 years, I'll be rounding up my session. That's one of the things I really love about this university.
Welcome back. We are still at the office of the Director of Scinnovent Center, Dr. Maurice Bolo, and we are discussing the topic, the dynamics of research and innovation for change and development in Africa. Doug, before we left for the break, we were talking about research and how important it is. We wanted to know, why do we do research when we can't even get 1% of the world research? Is it just for promotion? Or is it just for, as you said, people just do research because that is what they are supposed to do, to get to the end of professorship and all of that. So why do we do research? Do we do it to benefit the locals, or we do it just because we are doing research?
Thank you very much. I mean, that's an interesting question. There are various motivations for research. One is that as Africa, we must make our contribution to the global stock of knowledge.
Right.
And so we must be players in that research arena, if you want. That is the only way we bring in our ideas and our views onto the discussion table. There are also questions about research for career progression, research for research's sake. And there are people who are in research because they just love doing research. But more importantly, the question is, how does that research relate to our development needs?
Right.
So the question is about, do we do need-based research or demand-driven research, as they call it, or market-driven research, Or do we just focus on research for the sake of knowledge generation and knowledge for what? So the discussion has been that now we need a shift from just doing research for research's sake, for generating knowledge and saying now we have this, much as that remains important in the realm of what you'd call basic research. Still very important. But at the same time, given Africa's needs, we need probably a lot more focus on the applied component of research. That is research that is almost directly relevant to our development needs, and that is where the discussion is at the moment. Now, that means we need to be fairly well attuned to our development needs and priorities.
Right.
Where do our governments want to go? And a moment ago, I talked about forward-looking development blueprints and our aspirations for, achieving certain targets by 2030, whatever year it is. The other thing is what is now called the Sustainable Development Goals. How does Africa plug into that? How does our research plug into the Africa we want, the African Agenda 2063, the STISA 2024, and other development priorities? Now, the other component of your question is about research for whose benefit. All right, is it just us, the researchers, or are we thinking about the communities? And this is about now uptake and relevance. There has been a discussion about how we organize and generate our research and apply it. If you are familiar with the discussions, there has been issues about Mode 1 and Mode 2. Mode 2 being promoted by people like Helga Nowotny, Michael Gibbons from 1994 coming up front. And the idea is that you need to generate now knowledge in the context of its application. Why is it important? You are going to do agricultural research in Kenya. Who are those that are supposed to benefit or take up this research? And how do you relate with them? How do you bring their voices in defining the research agenda? How do you carry them along in the research process? And how do you support them to utilize the findings of your research? So this is the whole discussion about Mode 1, Mode 2 kind of research approaches. The other thing is about the frameworks that we use for our own research, and there's been a lot of focus on innovation and innovation systems. And we're now saying different actors are interacting. We are talking about not just generating knowledge, but applying knowledge for development. So in that context then, we really need to be very careful about how do we integrate the users of our research. Now, there is a discussion which is not settled in the research community about whether that lowers the quality of research. Or does it enhance, the excellence of research and how we publish in the so-called high impact factor journals.
Yes, and even talking about the actors, it brings me to the question of intellectual properties.
Correct.
And then in this 21st century where we have open access, how do we as Africans in developing our research to improve our development, how do we tread this line? Because it's a very thin line when we talk about intellectual property and in a world where there is an open access. How do we tread this thing line to benefit from research commercialization, to benefit on what we as a people have been able to develop through our research?
Very good. I mean, issues of intellectual property rights protection and issues of open access or open innovation is an interesting debate. Interesting because it has what I would call ideological or philosophical basis, and it also has the practical implications of it. And I will just talk about that a little bit. You look at the way mostly our research is funded, is largely publicly funded through taxpayers' money. All right? And therefore, the knowledge that we generate out of that process are supposed to be public goods that are publicly available. So that is one side of the debate. The other side of the debate is that universities are now getting much less funding, whether from the government or the donor community. So the funding environment is getting much more complicated. And now universities are being asked to generate much more income. The way to do that is to commercialize the findings of your research. And the way to do that is to turn that knowledge, which is a public good, into a private good. The vehicle to do that is your intellectual property rights. All right. So this is where IP comes into the debate, to transform that public knowledge into a private good that you can now sell into the market, if I was to use those words. Now, ideologically, these two things sit in the same department in the same universities, and yet they're contrasting.
Right.
So if I am a researcher and I generate money, I get money from government funding to generate certain products, do I go for releasing that as a public good, or do I? So that's a question at the ideological level. The other thing is about our own capacities then at the universities to, one, identify what has the potential for intellectual property rights protection, the mechanisms to then protect it, the resources to go and protect it, and then to maintain it.
Right.
All right? And so we have all these challenges. Most of our universities now have institutional intellectual property rights policies. Most of them, not all, but most. These actually set up the technology transfer offices, or what they call intellectual property management offices in the universities, that are supposed to then help the researchers manage the IP component of their work.
Right.
But we do have a challenge. These structures are established, they are under-resourced, and they are understaffed. So a lot of times they don't actually achieve the potential that they should. But at least the structures are there, so we can begin from there. The general point being that we need to worry about, one, the policies at the universities, how that deals with issues of access, issues of ownership, issues of access, benefit sharing at the university level. Then we need to build capacities of our technology transfer officers to engage with the private sector. Thirdly, we need adequate innovation infrastructure.
So talking about all this important, this is where we realize the importance of this center. So we want to talk more on the center and want to know, who are your collaborators? Who do you work hand in hand with? Do you work with the government? Do you work with other non-governmental organizations to push research policies through? Yes,
so if you want, our collaborators are organized into what are called communities themselves. So we have the research community, those who generate the knowledge. Largely here are our universities and research institutes, essentially. So that is a research community. Then we have the private sector, or what we call the business community, because that linkage for us is critical. And so we have industry associations that we work with, we have the private sector actors that we work with, we have private companies, individual firms that we work with. And of course, government is our key actor, because the act of policy making really is an act of government. It's a role of the government and the decision makers. So if you look at that, and then of course we have our own colleagues in the civil society space, the NGOs, the development organizations, and the donor community. And so depending on what actual projects we have, we draw onto these different actor categories as and when necessary.
So what are some of the projects you've done so far?
Yes, a number of things that we have done so far. Currently, we are working on a very interesting project, what we call the Science Granting Councils Initiative, SGCI, which AAU is part of, by the way. So this is one of our very interesting components. And what we are doing as the center, our main role there is to enhance issues of knowledge transfer or knowledge exchange between the private sector and the academia, as facilitated by the Science Granting Councils in Africa. So we do what we call public-private partnerships in research innovation, and we promote that basically. So in that, we support research projects that bring in private sector and the researchers together to define research priorities, to execute those research priorities, and then to eventually commercialize this research. So in that respect, we have projects in different countries that are running currently. We have, for example, in Uganda, we are looking at issues of agricultural innovation and agribusiness around manufacturing and food processing. In Malawi, we are doing renewable energy. In Mozambique, we are doing tourism. In Cote d'Ivoire, we are doing food safety and agri-food innovation kind of project. So a number of that. But what we are trying to do is pilot a concept in which the private sector and the research community can come together to define research priorities and to work together towards commercialization.
That's fine. So we are almost wrapping up.
Good.
And before we go, we wanted to know what are some of your challenges as a center in getting these policies to governments and then the future prospects.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now getting the evidence into the government policy processes is a fairly tricky affair. One, because the nature of the policy making process itself only draws a little bit from research evidence. There are a lot of other factors that affect that domain.
Right.
So the question, first of all, you must have the right questions. The timing must be right. Okay? Because if you have a research today that is not required by government policy making, it will lie somewhere.
Right.
The language and the communication is equally very important. How do you present this result to the government? How do you package it? Because a lot of times we have large volumes of technical information that the government does not necessarily consume. And the question is, how do we translate that into popular articles in our daily magazines and news? Because a lot of times as researchers we are worried about journal articles and all that, but the policymakers don't necessarily read Lancet or Nature or all those other good journals. They read the newspapers on the streets. So how do we translate that? That is a problem. Researchers are not very good at communicating at that level. The other thing is about how do you translate that into policy briefs and policy statements that governments can pick and say, yes, this is how we want to go. Now, that's another challenge for researchers and research communicators. So there are issues about communication, there's issues about culture and how people operate, how the government bureaucracy and the process operates. Do researchers understand how government policy processes work? Do they know when the evidence will be required? Do they know the timing when to plug in? Do we have the resources to intervene when we need to?
Right.
If there's a meeting for public participation in one side of the country, do the researchers in the other side have even the money to travel to that place to go and make a presentation? Do we seek out commissions? So there are a lot of things in that area that we could highlight as challenges. But the way to deal with it, I think, is to be partners with the government.
Very important.
Yes.
The linkages.
Exactly. Work with them so that if you know they are going to be talking about biotechnology in Kenya and they're working on a biotechnology policy, fit yourself into that commission. Find yourself, how do I break in and bring in my own views into it? How do I work with them to generate the kind of evidence and information that they need to facilitate their work? Questions about ownership, questions about buy-in, questions about people accepting and acknowledging how you generated that information and how you reach the kind of conclusions that you reach.
Right. So the future prospects.
Looking very good, if you ask me. I think we are hitting the right spots in terms of what Africa needs.
Right.
We are beginning now to work a lot more on the linkages between the universities and the private sector. And I think that is where we need to go. We are now addressing issues around innovation and informal economy. Most of our economies in Africa are fairly informal. How do we deal with that? Do we have the capacity to think like our own informal SME kind of private sector is working? So that is an important thing. We are beginning now to work on issues of bioeconomy and trying to link our agricultural sector to industrialization, which is where Africa wants to go. So I think that is another very interesting component. We are working on issues of intellectual property rights, issues around governance. So the environment is getting better. I think it can only get better for Africa. Right.
Thank you very much for this insightful conversation. We are grateful, Dr. Maurice.
Thank you.
This has been AU Talks on AU TV with Dr. Maurice Bolo, the director of Scinnovent Center. Keep watching. Stay tuned.